Welcome back to Double D in the Morning. This is Double D in the Friday Morning, episode 45, The History of Cartoon Comedy and How It's Evolved Over the Years. Cartoon writing has improved over the time. As it used to be an adult cartoon writing, they wrote for what they thought was funny and what the adults would laugh at. They didn't think about, the blackface and all the negative. They wrote for what they thought was funny. And these pictures that I've posted are an example of the dark cartoon writing history of what used to be passive as comedy. But it wasn't funny then, it's not funny now. I'm just trying to get the point across that cartoon comedy writing has changed. It's still predominantly targeted as adult comedy. Even some of the kid-based cartoons have a lot of targeted towards adult comedy. A modern example of more of what would be considered an adult cartoon by today's standards would be The Simpsons or Family Guy or South Park. This is an old example of one of the logos for one of the old cartoon companies that did a lot of that adult-oriented comedy, MGM Cartoons. They were notorious for blackface and a bunch of other adult-oriented comedy because that's how they wrote back then. Because they wrote for themselves and not the Warner Brothers wrote like that too back then with the Looney Tunes. They used them as military war propaganda from 1941 to 1945 during World War II. And they used racial stereotypes with the Japanese and the Germans and all of the Axis powers at the time. This is the title card for one of the most famous Warner Brothers ones at the time that did that, Tokyo Jokio. This is a 1942 World War II propaganda cartoon parodying the Axis powers. And this is another example of wartime racism. This kind of political satire and blackface and all kinds of that kind of stuff from back then was meant to be a form of comedy and was a lowbrow form of comedy that got a couple of laughs back then, but it was still wrong today. It was wrong back then, and they don't do it no more. In the late 50s, Hanna-Barbera branched off into the first television cartoon company that specifically made television cartoons. They're the ones that stopped, for the most part, at the time, the racist cartoon stuff. I say for the most part because there was a Asian gag in the Flintstones when they were taking judo lessons or karate. But by the 1960s and 50s, when television cartoons were coming into play, that wasn't a lost art that they just didn't do anymore. They wrote more family oriented, and they're the ones that started with it. Another example that was a big change of cartoon comedy, back in the 60s and back in the day, even in the cartoons, they had the characters from the show promote the product that was the sponsor of the show, and Winston Cigarettes was the first sponsor of the Flintstones. So there was scenes with Barney, Fred, and Wilma smoking Winston cigarettes. That was cut out years later when it became, even though it was an adult prime time show, it became more of a family thing at houses and kids would watch the show. The advertisers of the show knew this and switched at Alka-Seltzer and Welch's and things like that for the sponsor and dropped Winston's as the sponsor. Another cartoon company that toned itself way down when they made it into TV instead of theatrical cartoons was the Looney Tunes. In the 50s and the 60s, when they continued to still do theatrical Looney Tunes shorts, they toned it way down. But they toned it down even more so when they started the Bugs Bunny show from 60 to 75. In the late 80s, from 88 to the early 90s, Ted Turner bought the classic libraries of what I've been talking about, MGM, Hanna-Barbera, and the Warner Brothers Looney Tunes. And then on October 1st, 1992, he formed what was then known as the Cartoon Network. This is the anthology show Toonheads that premiered the same day the network was founded on October 2nd, 1992. And if you can find any clips of this show anywhere, I would highly recommend to watch a little bit of it because it talks about Chuck Jones and his writing style, Tex Avery and his writing, Frisch Freleng, all the great masters, Mel Blanc, all the predecessors of people like Tara Strong and Great Lyle Griffin came from this Toonheads era. And one big thing that it talks about on the show is how the different writing styles and the different cartoons from different people From August 11th, 1991 until now, Nickelodeon started a cartoon trademark called Nicktoons. And their first 5 Nicktoons were very, very of their time, and they pushed the envelope. Ren and Stimpy, Doug, Rugrats, All Real Monsters, and Rocco. And I put a link in the top right hand corner that's about my best of Nicktoons, history of Nicktoons video from August 11th to 1991 till now. The first 5, well, the first 2 out of those 5, Ren and Stimpy and Rocco, really pushed the envelope, and they were in a way the South Park of the early 90s. They weren't as that bad, but the early Nicktoons really pushed the envelope to the yesteryear kind of comedy that they just were doing it for themselves, so they just did it. But after till about 1996, they still had some raunchy type stuff in the Nicktoons, but they heavily toned it down after about 96 and became more of a family friendly network up to that point, even more so. But originally 1/5 of the audience was adults, so the original jokes in the original cartoons was more adult oriented. But they have evolved over time in the 31 plus years that they've been doing it. And I personally like the older kind of comedy stylings. Not Ren and Stimpy so much, but just the old, more authentic of the old cartoon comedy ways. You have to look for that now, and they don't have the great comedy that they used to. Even though they did start to clean it up around 96, it was from 1999 to 04 that they really quit doing the pushing the envelope and started for a more mature, more serial, if you will, type of cartoons. They still had slapstick and they were still comedy, but that they were being more PC. They were a whole lot less PC in the original days of Nicktoons. Back when 1/5 of the audience was our parents watching it with us. Now we're the parents and we're watching with our kids. I don't have any, I was just saying that as an example. One of the I cannot believe they went there moments on Rocco with the Nicktoons was the Good, Bad, and the Wallaby when they hook Heifer up to a milk machine, and Hot Sot Raw when they're picking berries and he grabs at the bear's crotch. Around the same time, Nickelodeon was shaking it up with animation. In 1995, from 1997, there was a show called What a Cartoon that spawned every other, at the time, cartoon. That's what they called their cartoons on Cartoon Network that they ever did. Dexter's Lab, Courage the Cowardly Dog, Johnny Bravo, Powerpuff Girls. You name it, it came from the What a Cartoon. But later, the newer What a Cartoons came from something called the Big Pick Friday, where they would have shorts similar to the What a Cartoon thing. They would just randomly appear on the network, and then they would vote on CartoonNetwork.com which ones of the fans liked it, and whatever the fans liked is what they put on there. These cartoons also had their share of for the adult comedy for that 1/5 of the audience thing back on Cartoon Network. Ed, Edd and Eddy had it. Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy had it. Very kid friendly, but they also had their moments of not only for the adults, but just for them to understand type of comedy. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and hit the notification bell to Double D in the morning, so you always know about my videos every Friday and Sunday morning at 10. And follow me on my Facebook, Tumblr, TikTok, Instagram. And if you follow me on Facebook, remember that I'm going to invite you to my Facebook fan group, Drew's YouTube fan group. But it's invite only, so you have to follow me on Facebook first. Also, tell me in the comments if there's any cartoon comedy evolutions that I forgot to mention. Make sure to join me at Double D in the Friday Morning episode 46 when I discuss the history of... And make sure you join me next week for Double D in the Friday Morning episode 46, the history of cartoons part 37, the importance of your imagination if you want to be a cartoonist.